Described by the New York Times Magazine as having something approaching rock star status in her field, Joan C. Williams has played a central role in reshaping the conversation around work, gender, and class over the past quarter century. Williams is a distinguished professor of law, Hastings Foundation chair, and founding director of the Center for Work-Life Law. Williams' path-breaking work helped create the field of work-family studies and modern workplace flexibility policies.
Well, my first exposure to breastfeeding was that I had a baby. And my mother had certainly never breastfed. She had 4 children during the 50s and no breastfeeding. So I hadn't a clue. I knew I wanted to breastfeed, but I had a lot of challenges with my first child in breastfeeding. And I reached out to one of the common support organizations for breastfeeding. This was in 1986. And I have to say, they were at once extremely generous and helpful and extremely judgmental of the fact that I was continuing to work. And I thought, oh my goodness, there must be a better way. I did struggle through, and I ultimately did breastfeed both of my kids, if I remember correctly, for about 9 months. But it was at the beginning, it was not easy. And then when we started to get funding to work on breastfeeding, which I felt about pretty passionately about because I ended up loving it, just loving. I still miss it. I still miss getting a letdown. And my baby is 31, so I really liked it. But when we got funding to work on this, it was really disheartening to me to recognize that there has been a really ugly racial dynamic surrounding breastfeeding. And women, I mean, I was one of the lucky ones when I reached out. They answered my call and they did help me. But as I talked to breastfeeding advocates who are women of color, particularly Black women, their calls weren't even returned. And I thought, no, this is a central part of our mission to try to do some small part to heal that really ugly, painful racial dynamic. Yeah, as with all of this stuff, I had an extremely tough time with issues related to motherhood. I almost dropped out as a tenured law professor after my second child was born because it was just so overwhelming. And I just thought, like, this is completely crazy. If somebody as focused and driven as me is being driven out of the workplace, this is like almost impossible. This is crazy. I'm going to put a stop to this. I didn't, but I think I've helped somewhat. With respect to breastfeeding, as in all other ways, I was one of the lucky ones. I wasn't lucky in the sense that I never really managed to pump. I just couldn't get it to work. But I was super lucky because I lived very close to where I worked. And so I literally would drive back home and nurse like twice in the middle of the workday, which, most people, one of the reasons I started to work on motherhood is I had a very tough pregnancies as well. And was really, the first trimesters were pretty awful. And I realized, I would be fired if I had a real job, if I wasn't a professor. I always say being a professor is better than working. I worked very hard, but I would have been fired if during my first pregnancy, if I had had an ordinary, job, not a professor job. So I began to work on issues related to motherhood. And at first it was very simple. I mean, mothers were literally being fired and told it was because they were mothers, and federal courts were saying that was not illegal, that was not gender discrimination. And the very first thing that Work-Life Law did is we said, yes, it is. It is gender discrimination. We documented that it's like the strongest form of gender discrimination. And we turned that law around. For years, I would not work on breastfeeding because the focus of Work-Life Law has always been to kind of grab rights where nobody thinks they exist under current law. because my sense when I founded Work-Life Law in the 1990s was that there was not going to be any federal legislation that was going to be helpful. And you know how much federal legislation, Lisa, there has been that's helpful? None. So we have always focused on grabbing rights where people thought there were none. And for a long time, until just within the past 5 years, the federal courts were saying, I know you will not believe this, being a non-lawyer, but the Pregnancy Discrimination Act prohibits discrimination based on pregnancy and related medical conditions. And bless their hearts, federal courts were saying that nursing was not a related medical condition related to pregnancy. It's like, okay. So that I didn't work on it because there was just, there was no room to maneuver. But immediately when federal courts started to join the human race and understand that nursing was a medical condition related to pregnancy, we began to go after those rights with very generous support from the Kellogg Foundation. And one of the things that we have found, I've been running Work-Life Law for 25 years now, is a real shift. Many of the people in foundations, as you know, are women, and many of them are young women, and many of them are mothers. And when we first started to raise money for this, people thought we were crazy. Don't you want to help get women in blue collar jobs? Like, well, that's great, but no, we work on motherhood. Well, motherhood is about choice, not about discrimination. Well, excuse me, choice and discrimination aren't mutually exclusive categories. But now, luckily, there are a number of young women who have gone through all of this, who work in private foundations, and they've been wonderfully supportive to us. And the Kellogg Foundation has been fabulous, such an amazing supporter. Before that, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation funded us for almost a decade.
Do you see the quarantine, COVID, and the way the world is changing right now as an opportunity for this to pick up momentum, the work that you're doing to advocate for women's rights in the workplace?
Well, as somebody who was one of the original work family people, who literally helped invent and disseminate one of the key work family policies in law firms, and was one of the generation that invented workplace flexibility policies, I had actually stopped working on them because I just saw no progress as of 3 years ago, 2 years ago. And COVID, horrible as it has been, and a lot of people have died, it's been awful, has really pushed the work family arena in a very, we always said it's only a failure of imagination that's keeping back remote work. And you know what was keeping back remote work, Lisa? A failure of imagination that was remedied in about 3 weeks flat last March, March in 2020. And all of a sudden, so many people were working remote. And so that's a big step forward. And the fact that many employers are now considering hybrid work schedules where only some days a week are on site has the potential to really help working mothers. People of color too, by the way, who are far more likely to want to continue remote than white people are. So we're really at one of these moments of great opportunity, but there's also an accompanying risk. Because if we have a scenario where women and people of color are much more likely to choose to continue with remote work, whereas, your basic white guy is on site full time, and employers don't manage this carefully, you're going to have the people who are working remote even more disadvantaged by the fact that they're out of sight, out of mind. And so we published an article in Harvard Business Review just in the last couple of weeks that provides some guidance on, and we have a full toolkit on the www.biasinterrupters.org website to help employers manage successfully the transition to hybrid work so that it actually enhances their diversity and inclusion goals rather than undermines them.
That's just excellent, Joan. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like for the conference attendees to know about your work before we go?
Just that I thank all of the conference attendees who dedicated their time to making it so that women can breastfeed and making it so that women can breastfeed their children and support their children. Because, for me, I've loved my career and I've just loved being a mother, loved having babies. And the fact that women should have to sacrifice one or the other makes no sense. So thank you all.